Hello, my name is Sarah Foulkes, and I'm a student on the Masters of Community Planning program at Vancouver Island University. I'm speaking to you today from the traditional lands of the Sanemo First Nation, where I'm lucky enough to live. The project I'm going to be speaking to you about today is the research I've been conducting on planning for sustainable seaweed aquaculture on Vancouver Island. So I just want to give you an indication of how the talk is going to go today. Obviously, we're going to start with the introduction, then we're going to move into my research questions, historical and modern day uses of seaweed, food security in BC, food resiliency on Vancouver Island, the environmental benefits of the seaweed aquaculture industry, concerns that are known for the seaweed aquaculture industry, and also the role of planners. So firstly, I do have 5 research questions guiding this project, and this is the ones here. So the first one is, what practices are required to establish a sustainable seaweed aquaculture industry in BC? How can seaweed aquaculture contribute to the economic development of coastal communities on Vancouver Island? How can seaweed aquaculture contribute to the food system resiliency of Vancouver Island communities? What roles can planners play in the implementation of the seaweed aquaculture industry? And finally, given that current awareness of the industry within BC is low and the process to establish a seaweed aquaculture site is very complex, how can planners be effective educators for the seaweed aquaculture industry? So we're just going to begin by looking at some historical and modern day uses of seaweed. So seaweed has been part of the diet of First Nations peoples in BC since time immemorial, and it continues to be an important food source to this day. In Asia, seaweed is a staple food, and China currently controls 60% of the global seaweed market. However, global popularity is increasing, and I do fully expect that Vancouver Island is going to be part of this trend. Seaweed has many uses in the modern day food industry and beyond. So of course, it can be consumed in a product as its own right. For example, those seaweed snacks that you see at the supermarket. It can also be used in a food additive industry to make nutrient supplements, and also a vegan alternative to gelatin. And also it can be used as animal feed. There is evidence to show that feeding livestock seaweed rather than traditional animal feeds can actually help reduce the amount of methane that they produce. And it can also be used, the seaweed can also be used as a fertilizer in other land-based agricultural practices. It can even be used in food packaging. The seaweed has been shown to help to actually be used to make a sort of plastic type material. So it actually can come into play at many different levels of the food system. Seaweed aquaculture is also a very good industry in terms of responding to the Sustainable Development Goals. It addresses 6 of the Sustainable Development Goals, which are part of the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. Firstly, zero hunger. Seaweed aquaculture has been implemented in developing countries across the globe and has been shown to improve the food security of local communities. While Canada is a developed nation, many people in our population also struggle with receiving an adequate food supply. Good jobs and economic growth. Later, we're going to talk about this a bit more in a Vancouver Island context, but globally, this growing industry has been found to be very beneficial and has often actually been taken on by women in a community to increase their capacity for economic independence. Responsible consumption and sustainable communities. We'll also look into later the environmental benefits that the seaweed aquaculture industry can bring. And we will be and this industry will be part of an important step towards creating a food industry which is more environmentally responsible. Part of this industry is allowing communities to consume more responsibly. This also ties into the goals of climate action and life below water. Seaweed can not only have a low environmental impact, but it can actually sometimes help reverse the effects of climate change, which are currently threatening our oceans. So food security, as defined by the United Nations Committee on World Food Security, means that all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their food preferences and dietary needs for an active and healthy lifestyle. The most recent statistics I could find for Canada as a whole showed that between 2017 and 2018, 4.4 million Canadians were living in a food insecure household. I've included this map to show how BC compares to the rest of Canada. So 12.4% of households in BC were found to be insecure between 2017 and 2018. But this was an increase from the 2015 to 2016 study, and it is expected to increase again, especially due to the recession which is expected to follow the COVID-19 pandemic. And this is because household income is the best indicator we have of food security. So it goes that if a household has very low income, they are much more likely to be food insecure. Obviously, if they have a high income, they are much more likely to be secure because they can afford to buy themselves an adequate food supply. The Vancouver Island Economic Alliance has identified tourism as one of the main industries on Vancouver Island, but tourism jobs tend to come with characteristics which increase the risk of food insecurity. And this is because it tends to feature naturally around seasonal work, shift work, irregular hours, ununionized positions, and a lack of job mobility. Seaweed agriculture, the timing of it actually fits really well around the tourism industry, because the most active parts of their year are over the winter and the early spring, whereas of course summer is definitely more active for the tourism industry. So even though it is not year-round employment in one industry, it does offer job opportunities year-round, which are within communities which also participate already in tourism. Or seaweed aquaculture can actually be used really well in tandem with other aquaculture practices, and we will touch on some of these as we go forward. However, these statistics don't show the full story. The majority of fruit and vegetables that are eaten in BC are actually imported from California. And this leaves BC in a very precarious position, as California has been facing worsening droughts over the recent decades. If one day California is no longer able to supply BC communities with fresh fruit and vegetables, and BC has not planned for this eventuality, it is going to cause widespread food insecurity. Which just brings me on to my next topic of food system resiliency. So food system resiliency on Vancouver Island is a particularly pertinent issue. So I'll just do a couple of definitions to make sure we're all on the same page. So firstly, a food system. This is the chain of activities connecting food production, processing, distribution, consumption, and waste management. And there is a diagram in the middle, which I found quite helpful in the past, just showing how different aspects of the food system do link together. Food system resiliency is the ability that a community food supply has to readily adapt to changes in the external and internal conditions. So Vancouver Island used to produce a lot of its own food, but over recent decades, the amount of food which is produced here only accounts for about 15% of the total food eaten in Vancouver Island communities. Reliance on imported food leaves communities vulnerable if there were to be disruptions to food supplies. An example that's commonly used is if there was an earthquake, which meant that the ferries were no longer able to run and food was not able to get here. Or I'm sure we can all think back to this time last year when the pandemic definitely was leaving empty spaces on our grocery store shelves. So this means that Vancouver Island has a low food system resiliency. And this means it's very important for us to start focusing on producing food which does not rely on outside assistance. And this is where seaweed could come in. The Pacific Seaweed Growers Association has identified Vancouver Island as the ideal place for a seaweed aquaculture industry to thrive. So there are quite a lot of environmental benefits that we're going to look at next. And then following that, we're going to look at the considerations. So firstly, seaweed is a really, really good carbon sink. It actually sequesters a lot of carbon from ocean water. So the increased amount of carbon dioxide that's found in the atmosphere then dissolves into the oceans, and seaweed can actually help take this carbon out. So the issue with having more carbon in the ocean is that it increases ocean acidification. So seaweed can actually help to neutralize ocean water. Seaweed itself is also very tolerant of ocean acidification. So it can be put into an area which is suffering from ocean acidification and actually help neutralize the water around it and allow species to move back in. This is just one form of habitat restoration that seaweed is useful for. The actual seaweed plants itself, while they're being grown, can act as a habitat for juvenile fish. And what has shown to be very successful in Australia is actually surrounding salmon farms with seaweed aquaculture beds. Because what this does is that any of the waste that is produced by the salmon is then actually taken up by the seaweed. So it doesn't the harmful waste products don't go into the wider environment. And actually, as I learned this week, this seaweed is actually still completely safe for human consumption. So not only is it environmentally beneficial, but it can also be sold as another product, which can help increase the amount of food produced from the same ocean footprint. And finally, seaweed aquaculture has been shown to help stabilize shorelines because the seaweed beds actually slow the wave energy. So it is hitting the land with less force and therefore reducing the amount of coastal erosion which occurs. There are, of course, industry considerations to be taken into account. And we're going to look at those next, and that will be environmental considerations, food safety considerations, and collaboration between key players. So in terms of environmental considerations, probably the one which is at the forefront of most people's minds is the use of non-native species. So there is, of course, if you decide to start growing a species which is not native to BC in BC waters, there is the risk of genetic pollution. And by this we mean there is the risk of the introduced seaweed breeding with the wild seaweed populations. So for example, at least one site in BC, I know they are growing nori, which is actually a Japanese species, so grown on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. In Europe, they use the Pegasus guidelines, which suggest a best course of action of only using native species. However, they do acknowledge that modified or non-native species could be appropriate in some situations. They suggest that you could breed together a native species, several native species, to make one which is suitable for aquaculture. So it would have a high yield and it would grow relatively quickly. However, this does raise the question of what does local actually mean? So how far from the actual growth site can you go before a species is no longer considered local to that area? And also, if you are creating a new species of seaweed, the testing process that will need to take place before inserting it into the ocean is extensive. Seaweed has very high phenotypic plasticity, and this means it can behave very differently depending on the environmental conditions that it's in. So you would have to do extensive testing, which is timely and also time-consuming and expensive in the lab before implementing it on a growth site. They have suggested that you could use non-native species and just make sure they're sterile. However, this does mean growers have to rebuy seed each year, and growers cannot cultivate their own strains which are particularly suited to their growth site. Biosecurity is also an issue, as when you are transplanting seaweed, even if it's a native species, there is the risk of it bringing a pathogen or a pest to the area, which could not only infect the growth site, but also impact the wild species of seaweed around it. Globally, there has been found to be a lack of terminology and a lack of understanding of a stakeholder responsibility, which does mean that lots of people just who are partaking in the industry just don't realize whose responsibility it is to monitor this. So this is something that BC will definitely have to address before the widespread growth of this industry. Food safety. So obviously, much of the seaweed that I anticipate being growing around Vancouver Island hopefully will be eaten by humans. So of course needs to be safe. So seaweed is a biofilter, and this means it can accumulate heavy metals within itself. So if there is any heavy metals in the ocean surrounding it, the seaweed will take it in and it will store it there. And it could potentially get up to life-threatening concentrations. However, I will say that the risk of this happening in a cultivated species is very low, and this risk is really only associated with wild harvest. However, it is something that growers need to be aware of. One way which this can be handled is by planting indicator species. So I don't know how many people watching this like wine tasting and visiting vineyards, but you may have noticed that they tend to plant roses alongside grapevines. And this is because grapes and roses are actually susceptible to very similar diseases. However, the roses display the effects of the disease much sooner than the grapevines. And there is a species of seaweed called Porphyra, and this is very good to plant alongside a cultivated species because it will show if there have been any heavy metal contaminants before the cultivated species. So collaboration between key players is really going to be the make or break of the industry's success. I recently attended a conference on seaweed aquaculture in BC, and the main take-home message of every speaker was that collaboration was going to be a vital part of the industry as it grows. Not only companies that are working within BC, but also on a global scale through projects such as Ocean 2050, which is the research project between 12 different countries on the environmental impacts of the seaweed aquaculture industry. So I've said several times, seaweed aquaculture pairs really well with other types of aquaculture. And the benefit of pairing them together with a pre-established site is that it makes for a much faster approval process. So for example, someone could already hold a shellfish tenure, which they're using to cultivate food, and they can just amend that lease to make it suitable for seaweed as well. However, someone who wants to start a brand new seaweed farm has to go through a very long approvals process, which can take years and requires at least 3 levels of government approval. The local government level, the provincial government, and then finally the federal government. And also many of the current seaweed aquaculture industries are managed at least in part by First Nations communities. So this adds a 4th level of government approval onto the process. The lengthy application process was one of the largest complaints of the producers at the conference which I attended. And this brings me to my next point. I have already mentioned the industry already has heavy involvement by many First Nations communities on the island. And any growth going forward needs to ensure that meaningful participation from these communities is maintained. Historically, there have been issues where First Nations communities are unable to access traditional harvesting sites due to the prioritization of industry. Making sure history does not repeat itself is one of the key parts of the success of the seaweed aquaculture industry. So I also wanted to now just show you a little bit of global inspiration, just to try and make sure that you are fully understanding and enthusiastic of the benefits that the seaweed aquaculture industry can bring. So first of all, this is Ocean Farmers in Madagascar. They are an organization who are helping to move people away from overfishing already depleted stocks of wild fish and instead teach them how to become seaweed farmers and use this as their primary source of income. They provide education and equipment in exchange for farmers agreeing to only use environmentally conscious practices. Ricalto is an organization which works in many different countries to foster sustainable and inclusive farming practices. They are working with seaweed farmers in Nusa Penida, which is an island located just south of Bali. They are not only expanding the industry in a sustainable way, but teaching farmers how to add value via tourism and also encouraging women in the communities to get involved by teaching them how to create additional seaweed-based products such as soaps and noodles, which are then sold in hotels on Bali. So it gives them a bit more income that way as well. Finally, this is probably one of the more unusual collaborations I've found, but this was a collaborative effort between Wave Dragon, who are based in the UK and Denmark, and also Seaweed Solutions, which are in Norway. So Wave Dragon make these red structures that you can see here, and they're used for capturing wave energy. So the waves are funneled into the structure using those big red arms. The waves then go up a slope at the back of the structure into a reservoir, where the water then exits through a turbine outlet at the bottom. This structure then creates calm conditions behind it, which could be beneficial to the seaweed aquaculture industry. I couldn't find any evidence to show that one of these farms now exists, but I did want to demonstrate that this collaboration does show that seaweed aquaculture is very flexible, and it can either be an addition to an established industry or an industry in its own right. So planners, what can people in this room actually do? So I do believe that planners will be valuable in this process for analysing the policies surrounding the current aquaculture legislation and making recommendations for their improvements. As part of my research, I will be interviewing planners and seaweed aquaculture professionals to find out what improvements need to be made. My current understanding is that the application process is geared towards shellfish and finfish farming, and much of it is irrelevant to the practice of seaweed farming. There are also numerous government bodies which need to approve the cultivation site, which makes the process very complex. While any farming in the ocean does need to be done with caution, the legislative process could be streamlined to aid people entering the industry. Planners can also help to identify where growth of this industry would be useful or appropriate via spatial analysis. Our broader understanding of community needs and the impact of different land uses mean that we can help determine good locations for growth sites and processing facilities. Planners can be advocates for and educators for the industry. The awareness of the practice of seaweed aquaculture is very low in BC compared to the Atlantic provinces, where the industry is well established. Many regional growth strategies on Vancouver Island already include provisions for growing other aquaculture practices, so seaweed cultivation could also be incorporated into these documents as well. I foresee seaweed aquaculture being a very important industry in the future of Vancouver Island, and it will have a large impact on communities here. There are many considerations to take into account, and the barriers to success are quite high, but the desire to grow this industry is strong. Not only will it increase our food system resiliency, but it will also provide jobs for many people in the region and contribute to our overall economic growth. The issues of food insecurity and food system resiliency are truly some of the most wicked problems facing communities in BC today, and our current food systems are just not sustainable. It is important for generations to come that we find and cultivate BC-grown food sources. Seaweed might not hold the answer to all of these problems, but it certainly is a step in the right direction, and a step that brings us closer to achieving a sustainable and resilient food system. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you've enjoyed my presentation. And if you do have any other questions, I do encourage you to reach out because I always enjoy talking about this. My email is there on the screen. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you for joining me today on my presentation on lessons from First Nations off-reserve housing needs assessment, assessing housing needs in the Metlakatla Cumulative Effects Management Program. My name is Myfannwy Pope. I am a Master of Resource Management student at Simon Fraser University, and I'm speaking to you today from the unceded and traditional territories of Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. These nations are leaders in housing policy, and I've looked to their resources and experts throughout this process. I'd also like to bring your attention to the picture on this slide. This is a housing development which developed in partnership between BC Housing and Metlakatla Development Corporation as an affordable housing development for Indigenous elders. It is this picture, along with the many other pictures of the beautiful Metlakatla traditional territory, have been generously provided by Metlakatla First Nation or the Metlakatla Cumulative Effects Management Program. So thank you to them for their generosity. So I would just like to start this slide off by saying that the assessment isn't done yet, so I'm not going to be sharing any specific data outcomes about from the assessment specifically. Instead, I'll be focusing on the story of the assessment and taking you through the point in which there was a recognition for the need for an assessment, how we came to understand the gaps in the traditional approach to the housing assessment, and the program and tools that were available to us to target and really refine the housing needs assessment that we did do to the Metlakatla Nation. And then overall, we'll go through some lessons learned about a model that I think can be applicable to other First Nations hoping to do a housing needs assessment for their members off reserve. So our story starts with a recognition of the need for a housing needs assessment for Metlakatla members who are renting off reserve, specifically in Prince Rupert, and the limitations of the traditional housing needs assessment for this goal. I was lucky that in November 2019, I was invited to the Metlakatla Traditional Territory to attend a workshop that was hosted through the Metlakatla Cumulative Effects Management Program. At this workshop, Metlakatla councillors and staff were there, along with Prince Rupert councillors, City of Prince Rupert councillors, and housing providers in Prince Rupert. All participants unanimously agreed that there was a housing crisis in Prince Rupert. They cited challenges such as lack of disaggregated data, lack of coordination between housing services, lack of housing supply, as well as an aging housing stock, and then the expected growth in the region due to planned port development and LNG boom. So here are some headlines that echo the sentiments of the participants. So if we zoom out, the crisis in Prince Rupert really reflects a national housing crisis. And this crisis does not just affect the urban environments that we traditionally think of, such as Vancouver or Toronto, but does really impact rural, remote, and Indigenous communities as well. So this national housing crisis is due to consists of decline in supply of affordable market housing, speculation and financialization of housing, which artificially drives up housing prices, and a decline in non-market or subsidized affordable housing policies and buildings since the 1990s. Metlakatla members who are living off reserve in Prince Rupert are facing a compounding housing crisis that faces Indigenous housing off reserve. So Indigenous housing off reserve faces rates of higher core housing need compared to non-Indigenous households. There are few dedicated resources and few disaggregated data sets to Indigenous housing off reserve, and there is an ambiguity around mandate. So who is responsible, and which lends to the need for collaborative solutions. So I just want to take you through a core housing need, which is a technical term that I've mentioned already in this presentation and will come up a lot throughout the report. This term is adapted from the Canadian Mortgage and Housing Corporation, or CMHC, and it's a measure of housing need. So to be in core housing need, a household must fail one or more of three criteria. Those criteria are adequate housing or adequacy, which means that homes do not require any major repairs. Affordable housing means that housing costs are less than 30% of the total before tax household income. Suitable housing just means that the household has enough bedrooms for the size and makeup of the resident household. So a household is in core housing need if it fails one or more of these criteria, and the combined household income is below something that's called the household income limit. And the household income limit reflects the maximum gross household income for eligibility in many affordable housing programs. And it's supposed to reflect the minimum income required to afford appropriate accommodation in the private market within the area that it's set. And so this is set for each city annually by CMHC. So BC recognizes that there's a housing needs crisis in Canada, and in 2018 they legislated a required housing needs assessment for local governments. You can see here on this slide that it outlines the legislation that they provided, as well as the guidance, outlines the key pieces that must be in a housing needs assessment. And just at the bottom is a sample of some of the templates that they provide in terms of where they expect you to go for data sources. However, the guidance that's provided and the required pieces itself have two major gaps. So one of them is there's a lack of guidance on addressing Indigenous needs and perspectives. Most of the data sources, such as Statistics Canada, aggregate Indigenous data, and so it's impossible to pull out things like Indigenous elders need housing or Indigenous families with single parents because it's not granular enough data. Secondly, there's a lack of methods for Indigenous governments to address housing off reserve. So these guidance documents and templates and legislation is really targeted at settler local governments and do not provide resources for First Nations governments to perform this assessment. So Metlakatla First Nation has understood and recognized the need to do a housing needs assessment and the unique circumstances and the challenges that this posed to the traditional housing needs assessment format and approach. So for the next bit, I'm going to go over the tools that Metlakatla has available to them to sort of address the gaps that the traditional housing needs assessment has in meeting their needs. So firstly, Metlakatla is one of 7 Tsimshian nations on the north coast of what is now called British Columbia. The nation has approximately 1,004 members. And the major city in the territory is Prince Rupert. So you can see that here on the map. And then just about 5 kilometers to the northwest is Metlakatla village. In 2014, in response to an LNG boom and LNG interest in the area, Metlakatla developed the SEM program, or the Cumulative Effects Management Program, in partnership with Simon Fraser University through a MyTax grant. The SEM program, which I will refer to as SEM going forward in the slides, is a resource management system that has 4 phases. So the first phase is about identifying values and priority values and the indicators that represent those values. So that's part of what makes the Cumulative Effects Management Program unique, is that it's very values focused rather than project focused, which is how traditional environmental assessments work. So in the first step, they identify priority values. They assign an indicator in which to measure that priority value. The phase 2 is establishing a baseline, so measuring those indicators and seeing where they are at the current phase. And then phase 3 is setting management triggers and thresholds. So where is it acceptable for that indicator to be, and where is it not acceptable? And then finally, phase 4 is the monitoring, management, and mitigation. So making sure that the indicator stays within an acceptable range for their priority values. So Metlakatla is in the midst of piloting 4 values in this program. These values span across 5 pillars: environmental, economic, social health, cultural identity, and governance. And these pillars represent the interconnectedness of the program itself. And housing was one of those pilot values, which represented the social health pillar. And it is now in phase 4 of this program. So to begin, Metlakatla, for housing, the housing value in the SEM program, Metlakatla began by setting a broad desired goal, which was that all Metlakatla members would be living in housing which meets their needs in terms of condition, size, and affordability. So the first step in setting up that SEM framework for housing was to select the priority value of housing and then assigning an indicator to housing. So the indicator that the SEM program uses for housing is the % of renter households in Prince Rupert that are in core housing need. So this, as the indicator, the next step was setting management triggers and actions. So you can see in this figure here on the slide that there was a standard zone, a cautionary zone, and a critical zone. So the standard zone is below 15% of Metlakatla renters in Prince Rupert being in core housing need. Cautionary zone is below 30%, etc. So a preliminary assessment, so assessing where they assess the baseline level of core housing need among renters, that was performed in 2016, found that 42% of Metlakatla renters in Prince Rupert were in core housing need, which was by far in the critical zone and needed to take action. Metlakatla recognized that they needed to take action to address that. So as part of this piece, the SEM program moved forward to look at collaborative solutions, because recognizing that the mandate ambiguity around off-reserve housing made Metlakatla's mandate lower for addressing housing off-reserve. So the steps for collaborative solutions included holding focus groups with Metlakatla renters in Prince Rupert, as well as housing experts and service providers, as well as the collaborative housing workshop, which I mentioned at the top of this presentation. All of these actions have led to the identification of a need for further baseline knowledge on housing, as well as a set of recommendations that came up and directions throughout this process. So it was at this point that I came to this program. I am the lead on this housing assessment team, but I'm supported by an SFU support person who is Katarina Kwan. She is a PhD student in the Resource Environmental Management Program, as well as a Metlakatla support person who is Philip Clement, and he's a staff member on Metlakatla Nation, for Metlakatla Nation, and as well as my academic supervisor, Tom Gunton. So we as a team recognized how this housing assessment was unique, but we also looked at the SEM program and how it provided direction, how it provided research on which to build, and it provided a set of tools that we can use to help address the unique situation that this housing assessment posed. So our objectives going into the housing assessment were, what are the major housing challenges for Metlakatla renters in Prince Rupert? How effective are existing housing programs in addressing these challenges? And what actions can Metlakatla take to address these challenges? So for the next bit, I'm going to go over these tools that were available through the SEM program and how we use them to help refine the housing assessment from this traditional housing assessment to one that really targeted Metlakatla's values and needs. So the tools that were available in the program included existing relationships between SEM project team members and Metlakatla, including having a Metlakatla member on the project team. So this allowed us a better ability to engage and get other members involved. Secondly, a shared SFU Metlakatla capacity, which did not take time away from in-house operations for Metlakatla, and also provided co-benefits for me as a student and the report for Metlakatla and the assessment of data. And it provided existing community development, the SEM program gave an existing community development management framework. So that whole set of housing value, community development value, indicators, the thresholds, and the management actions that were all developed through this community-based program. It provided existing qualitative community research. So this included qualitative input from renters on the housing landscape, including barriers to accessing adequate and affordable housing. And then finally, the Metlakatla membership census, or the MMC, which I may refer to it throughout the presentation, was a big tool in helping us refine this process. So it is a community designed and administered census for Metlakatla members above the age of 15 living on the traditional territory of Metlakatla First Nation. And it was created through the SEM program to collect value-specific data. This census offers Metlakatla specific data on housing, and because it was delivered this year, we were able to design questions that targeted the specific questions that Metlakatla had given to us for this housing assessment, and that the SEM program had pointed to as gaps in our knowledge. For our methods, we started with a literature review and then designed questions for the MMC, collected data using the MMC, and then analyzed data from the MMC. Then we took our analysis, excuse me, to a workshop for collaboration and consultation with Metlakatla staff and members. So the literature review honed in on the specific components generally included in a housing needs assessment and identified specific gaps that Metlakatla's goals for the housing needs assessment posed to it. So these pieces, community profile, supply, demand, core housing need, housing projections, gap analysis on the supply and demand, and recommendations are generally included in a traditional housing assessment that's gathered from several different sources, including the BC template, which I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation. However, the Metlakatla context also reflects those key limitations of the BC template that I identified earlier. So there's a lack of Metlakatla specific and disaggregated data available outside of MMC. The format here is meant for municipalities, so it's a different mandate. And then there's a lack of targeted populations and needs. And this specifically applied to Metlakatla's situation because we're looking at a specific population whose supply and demand is impacted by much larger external factors. So how to really get at understanding the needs within that context was not provided in the traditional housing needs assessment format. So to address these gaps, we turned to our SEM tools. Excuse me. And first off, we used the MMC. So this specifically provides nation-specific and granular detailed information for Metlakatla members. When we were doing the question design, we were thinking about a couple considerations. So commensurability is important. Core housing need is chosen because it is commensurable with CMHC and BC housing data and is required for housing grants and housing policy and all of these other important things from senior governments. And secondly, the specific concerns that had come out of the SEM program and from Metlakatla. So looking at renters, one question that had come out of the SEM program is, what is the service use? Who's using services? What services are Metlakatla members aware of? And then thinking about Metlakatla capacity. So what information is actually important and useful to the capacity that Metlakatla has to act on it. We don't want to overload them with a bunch of information. And finally, what is important to get from the Prince Rupert context? The MMC was then administered throughout November and December of 2020. It was during the coronavirus pandemic, so people were not going into the homes and helping people fill them out, which may have posed one limitation, but we worked with it. And analysis was occurred throughout January and February, and the MMC data, when necessary, was qualified using data from Statistics Canada, BC Housing, and City of Prince Rupert reports. So our final tool that we leveraged was existing relationships, and we used this to help engage members and staff at a housing workshop. So our objectives going into the workshop were to share key findings from the Metlakatla housing assessment, obtain feedback on an early draft of the housing assessment, and discuss how the assessment can best support the Metlakatla First Nation and their housing goals. So the feedback and input from these sessions were coded and included in the report and shaped the format of the report and the framing of the report. And having this piece in our process for doing this housing needs assessment really helped to add more community voice. It contextualized the MMC data. So for example, members in our workshops pointed out that the rental prices that the MMC had reported were actually much lower than real asking prices in the community. It implemented more community input on the design and use of the report. And then finally, it also helped recognize some of the limitations of the report. So ultimately, the use of the tools in the SEM program helped us to rejig the traditional housing needs assessment to the needs of Metlakatla. And the lessons that we learned out this process are applicable to other First Nations and other groups trying to do a housing assessment that poses challenges to that traditional format that I've shown here. So rather than the comprehensive information-heavy traditional assessment, we worked backwards from the goals, needs, and capacity of Metlakatla First Nation to shape what data we sought. The process allowed for more actionable recommendations, and it helped center Metlakatla collected data and Metlakatla voice. The outcomes of this assessment showed the value of how a community-based housing assessment, particularly one that's entrenched in a larger management framework that recognizes the interconnectedness of housing and other community values, how this can really help shape a useful report. So using SEM tools, we were able to identify the major challenges facing Metlakatla renters in Prince Rupert. The SEM program, along with our assessment and previous research, created building blocks for a housing program that Metlakatla First Nation could create to address these major challenges. The data that we collected offered support for collaborative solutions. So for example, working with service providers. And it also provided opportunities to change external policy and programs. So recognizing that certain eligibility requirements may be too strict or that these processes may be too burdensome. The next step in our process is to finalize the report and then present these recommendations to the Metlakatla Governing Council. But I'd like to emphasize these final lessons and takeaways from the process up until this point, because it shows a model for performing housing needs assessments. So housing needs assessments require community tools that allow for community-specific and centered data. They should lead to actionable items that consider the capacity and mandate of a First Nation government. They should be driven by and emphasize community voice. They should be embedded in a larger governance framework that recognizes the interconnectedness of community values. And then finally, they will still have limitations. So for example, the SEM program looked at core housing need, but core housing need does not begin to capture the expanse of housing goals that Metlakatla might have for housing overall. But it's important for housing assessments to recognize that. And to just end, I'd like to thank the myriad amount of people who've helped me with this process and have helped develop the housing value in the past. So it includes Metlakatla First Nation, MyTax for the funding. I'd like to thank Braden and Zersa, Miranda Layden, and Joycelyn Mitchell from Metlakatla First Nation for participating in our workshops. My project team, our key informants who helped with the design of the assessment, including Matt Thompson and Sarah Silver from Squamish Nation, and just everyone who's contributed to the work on the SEM housing value up to this date. If you have any questions about my presentation, my project, or about the SEM program generally, please feel free to contact me at myfannwy_pope@sfu.ca. Thanks so much for listening.
Good afternoon. My name is Dawn Smith, and I'm joining you today from the homelands of the Esquimalt and Songhees peoples. I'm thankful to these nations for the good care they have given this land in the past, present, and future. Under the land governance practices of the Songhees people, the little 1950s bungalow I am sitting in is on land cared for and held by the Crow-Sampson family. So I say a special acknowledgement and a thank you to that family as holders of this land. I am a white settler studying Indigenous community planning at the School of Community and Regional Planning at UBC. My specialization is Indigenous housing and specifically looking at the implications of UNDRIP on housing. I am interested in this research for two reasons. The first is that I worked for a decade in green building before I came to planning school. My interest in housing and its role in community development was a key driving reason for me to become a planner. Second, the Canadian National Housing Act of the 1930s lifted 3 generations of my family out of poverty. However, this same legislation systematically and methodically created poverty for Indigenous peoples. I see in my own family the power of housing policy to change our trajectory, and I want Indigenous families to benefit as well. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. My thanks to the Yukon chapter for hosting the conference and to my fellow presenters. I wish to thank 3 women who have guided my thinking on this topic. Jessie Hemphill, who opened our conference this week with such beautiful words, is my practicum supervisor. Dr. Maggie Lowe supervised my SSHRC research into UNDRIP and housing, which makes up the case study I'll discuss with you today. Finally, a thank you to my first-year advisor, Penny Gernstein, who encouraged my early thinking on the topic of UNDRIP and housing. This is what I plan to discuss with you today. First, the basics about what UNDRIP is and how to connect UNDRIP to your planning work. Then I'll demonstrate how to apply UNDRIP to planning using the case example of the BC Indigenous Housing Fund. Finally, I'll share some thinking around what UNDRIP means for non-Indigenous planners and what skills or abilities we should foster in ourselves and in our teams to implement UNDRIP. My hope is that by the end of this presentation, you'll be on your way to implementing UNDRIP in your planning work. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, UNDRIP, is a global human rights resolution passed by the UN in 2007. It has implications for Indigenous peoples worldwide. Canada endorsed it in 2016. In 2019, the BC government passed legislation which requires the BC government to collaborate with Indigenous governments to ensure that provincial laws become consistent with UNDRIP. Bill C-15 is federal legislation which also commits the federal government to aligning Canadian laws with UNDRIP. And Bill C-15 just passed third reading a few weeks ago. Towns and cities in BC are also starting to implement and adopt UNDRIP, including the town of Gibsons and the city of Courtenay. So municipal, federal, and potentially municipal, provincial, and potentially federal laws are committing non-Indigenous governments to aligning their Canadian laws with UNDRIP. UNDRIP creates a framework to share power and authority between non-Indigenous and Indigenous governments. It fundamentally supports shared decision-making over all topics, including laws, land, and resources. UNDRIP contains 46 articles, and each article explains an Indigenous right held by every Indigenous group in Canada and in the world, such as the right to self-determination, the right to establish and control their own educational systems, and the right to maintain and strengthen their own distinct legal systems. The full history and depth of UNDRIP is beyond the scope of my presentation, but I will say that a lot of intelligent, dedicated Indigenous people worked globally for decades to make UNDRIP. It is an impressive accomplishment, and I am grateful to them for their hard work. Pressure is mounting on governments and by extension planners to implement UNDRIP. Here are just a few examples beyond the legislation I just mentioned. Implementing UNDRIP was a key recommendation from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. As the recent news of the unmarked graves of 215 Indigenous children in Kamloops demonstrates, the work of the TRC remains a pressing and urgent issue. The 2019 Canadian Institute of Planners policy on planning practices and reconciliation calls on planners to implement UNDRIP in their work. And in the most recent Planning West magazine, Jesse Hemphill and Bill Bolzner's article suggests that planners should take UNDRIP as a signal to get serious about joint decision-making arrangements for planning and land use management. Planners then, as the facilitators and implementers of policy, will hold a significant role in implementing UNDRIP. This is because our work directly interfaces with land use, long-term planning, and brokering decisions between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments. Our profession stands at the crosshairs of pressure to implement UNDRIP. The success of UNDRIP will rely on how well all governments, Indigenous and non-Indigenous, can work together to collaborate in the spirit and intent of the Declaration. It's well documented that our provincial and federal governments have repeatedly failed to uphold Aboriginal laws. UNDRIP is a new opportunity to prove our intentions of moving towards reconciliation. What is clear is that implementing UNDRIP will require unprecedented cooperation and pluralism between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments. Here are 3 insights that I think you should know on your way to incorporating UNDRIP into your work. The first is scale. The rights described in UNDRIP are collective rights held by Indigenous peoples, plural. This means that UNDRIP articles are not about the rights of individual Indigenous people, but about the rights of Indigenous nations as a whole. In essence, UNDRIP says that Indigenous nations should define, control, create, and manage their own projects using their own concepts and standards. As we will see, this has far-reaching consequences for the work of planners. Second, UNDRIP places Indigenous culture and law as central and paramount. Take, for example, the question, who can apply for this Indigenous housing program? Now, UNDRIP answers this question by saying anyone is an Indigenous person if they meet the standards upheld under the laws of that nation and not under Canadian law. This means that Indigenous nations, through their own legal traditions and teachings, define who are their members and so who those rights apply to. So the question, who can apply for this Indigenous housing program, quickly becomes unanswerable by anyone other than the nation. To my fellow non-Indigenous planners, please do not be lulled into thinking this is a minor point. I'm foreshadowing some of the skills planners need to implement UNDRIP: patience, creativity, and the ability to listen deeply. Finally, as will become evident in my case example, UNDRIP rights cannot be implemented without material, reciprocal, collaborative partnerships led by nations. This is well beyond planning practices of consultation or right to information to a much higher, deeper standard. UNDRIP will require a deep, holistic partnership between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments. One of our conference themes has been First Nations-led planning. And let me be clear, I think UNDRIP goes far above and beyond asserting just First Nations-led planning. It will require non-Indigenous following. UNDRIP positions nations as framing for themselves and in their own language and laws the priorities, processes, and methods to move towards the goals that they articulate. And UNDRIP requires that non-Indigenous governments and planners follow and support. So in summary, UNDRIP rights are collectively held. The nation defines and leads key aspects of any project, and UNDRIP requires unprecedented levels of collaboration and cooperation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments led by nations. So, I've shared with you a little about the context of UNDRIP, the connection between UNDRIP and planning, and offered you a few key thoughts to consider in your own efforts to pick up UNDRIP and incorporate UNDRIP articles into your work. Next, I'll share the research I conducted under the supervision of Dr. Maggie Lowe. We've been looking at how UNDRIP articles might be incorporated into a housing program, using the example of the BC Indigenous Housing Fund. So let's head over to the case example. The Indigenous Housing Fund was launched in 2018 before UNDRIP legislation was passed. The fund provides $550 million over 10 years to build and operate social housing on and off reserve. The purpose of the program is to create 1,750 units of social housing. The program accepts applicants from a wide variety of proponents, including First Nations, Métis, and Indigenous nonprofit housing providers. The Indigenous Housing Fund is remarkably flexible in terms of who is permitted to apply. Anyone who self-identifies as an Indigenous housing organization is invited to apply to the program. The fund is also unique. It is the first time that BC Housing has funded on-reserve rental housing. Like most government housing programs, BC Housing supplies the funding for the housing, but does not operate the buildings or maintain them over time. And critically, organizations that apply to the program must demonstrate capacity to carry out the development of the housing as well as to manage and operate the housing. This is a significant capacity, and it includes contributing land or cash and paying professional fees. With Dr. Lowe's support, I identified a handful of UNDRIP articles that connect directly to housing. I then systematically thought about how each UNDRIP article might relate to the BC Indigenous Housing Fund. So next, I'll take you on a tour of 4 UNDRIP articles and explore what they might mean to housing programs. The questions I asked were, how might the BC Indigenous Housing Fund incorporate UNDRIP principles? And what would change? Article 11 of UNDRIP states that Indigenous peoples have the right to practice and revitalize their cultural traditions and customs. In the context of housing, then, this implies the right to restore and improve housing traditions and customs. If planners incorporated this principle into housing, what might that look like? Well, first, since each nation has its own traditions and customs, it suggests a role for housing planners to become culturally adept at listening to and supporting a nation's traditions and practices. This will require planners develop skills to learn about Indigenous cultures, and when they do not understand, remain a project supporter. Second, it suggests that housing staff should support nation-developed housing programs which align with the nation's own customs and traditions. This would be more practical than building provincial-scale programs that are flexible enough to accommodate the wide variety of practices held by different nations, each with their own unique cultural traditions and practices. So in the case of BC housing programs, this would be a shift away from a uniform delivery of a provincial-wide program where nations apply for the right to participate towards flexible nation-led projects. Finally, as the high-density towers of the Seaweed development in Vancouver shows, revitalizing housing custom traditions and customs may mean the need to change zoning, bylaws, or create flexible intergovernment arrangements. Planners then have a role in advocating and supporting projects as they move through an often Byzantine approvals process. So this suggests that planners should be skilled at listening to and supporting nations in articulating their housing customs and traditions, and that planners should develop housing programs which are fundamentally flexible and centered on what the nation decides is important. Article 21 is the right to the improvement of Indigenous peoples' social and economic conditions. In its most simple interpretation, this right implies an improved quality, quantity, and affordability of housing. However, it also identifies that the process of implementing UNDRIP needs to uplift, center, and restore Indigenous communities on their own terms. In other words, the process of implementing UNDRIP needs to improve social conditions. If planners incorporated this principle into housing, what might that look like? First, it suggests that planners should be intentional and aware in the quality of relationships they build with a nation and devote resources to improving and supporting that relationship. Second, the process of creating housing should improve social conditions within the Indigenous community. And finally, planning needs to support projects with social outcomes, such as housing for single-parent families or housing for members in recovery. What remains crucial is that determining which social and economic conditions are improved and how they are improved is decided by the nation and not non-Indigenous planners. Article 23 states that nations have the right to determine and develop the priorities and strategies of development, including the right, as far as possible, to administer these programs through their own institutions. If planners incorporated this principle into housing, what might that look like? Well, it means we should support nations in setting up their own systems to prioritize housing improvements. We should also support them in operating and growing their development strategies to improve their housing. This support might include offering staff training on long-range planning, assisting with capital development and infrastructure plans, etc. The key is that nations have the right not just to prioritize what housing is to be improved, but also how it is to be improved. This means that planners could not just ask for a nation to rank buildings to be replaced and then replace the buildings in whatever way our government deems fit. Nations have a right to participate and co-determine the how of how housing is improved. So this means that nations have the right to determine and develop the priorities and strategies to improve housing, as well as to administer housing programs through a nation's institutions. By implication, then, this reimagines the role of housing programs and planners. Programs are no longer based on the command and control of the production of housing, but in the support of nations to determine and implement their own housing programs. Finally, Article 39 is the right to access financial and technical support from the state so that Indigenous peoples can enjoy UNDRIP rights. In the context of housing, this implies that nations have a right to access the financial and technical support they require to enjoy their housing rights ensured under UNDRIP. This is a significant right. It implies the financial and technical support to access land for housing, as well as the significant cost of construction, repair, and maintenance. This draws me back to my earlier point that UNDRIP are collective rights held by all Indigenous nations. UNDRIP rights are held by all nations regardless of how remote, small, or deemed low capacity by non-Indigenous measures. This means that to align with UNDRIP, housing programs should support all nations in accessing housing programs, regardless of how much financial or technical support they might need. So if planners developed housing programs and policies, we're going to incorporate this principle. What might that look like? Well, housing programs should offer technical and financial support towards the goal of returning housing to nations. This is an inversion of the current process. Instead of the Indigenous organization having to prove they can participate, the nation receives the support required to succeed. The process of applying to the program then becomes a source of support and not a barrier to entry. So in summary, what insights can we gain about how UNDRIP might be incorporated into housing programs and policies, and what this might mean for planners? These 4 UNDRIP articles we just reviewed together show how implementing UNDRIP could profoundly change housing programs in BC. Instead of the current Indigenous housing Indigenous Housing Fund model, which is fairly uniform, inflexible, and merit-based, the shift would be towards flexible patient programs determined and delivered by the nation. The lesson here is that you have to go slow to go fast. Future housing programs, which incorporate UNDRIP, are likely to be attuned to the unique practices of the nation, create affordable housing focused on healing and supporting communities, and offer financial and technical support to nations to develop their own housing programs. A few closing words of encouragement to non-Indigenous planners seeking guidance on how to implement UNDRIP. There are two reasons to stay brave and not succumb to overwhelm when selecting UNDRIP articles to analyze. First, UNDRIP emerges from Indigenous worldviews in which everything is deeply interconnected. This is what Jesse Hemphill calls webbed systems. In a web system, there are many ways to arrive at any given point. For example, anyone who has worked on a First Nations Health Authority health and wellness plan knows that wellness is inextricably linked to housing issues. Wellness and housing are linked. In the words of Indigenous scholar Atleo, everything is one. I urge you not to waste this precious opportunity we have to move forward and build better relationships through implementing UNDRIP. Do your best, don't get hung up, and move forward. Second, following any article in UNDRIP will quickly lead you to the realization that you can move no further without a good conversation and a good relationship with Indigenous nations. Those good relationships and good conversations will lead you to whatever additional UNDRIP articles you need to reference. If the Indigenous people you are working with tell you that another UNDRIP article is important and should be added, be grateful for the feedback and add it. I urge you to be humble, to work hard, listen hard, and arrive at the table having done some deep thinking of your own. Finally, support and develop your capacity and the capacity of your teams to be curious, flexible, and patient. Train and reward staff who show these skills. Focus primarily on the quality of relationships with your Indigenous colleagues and collaborators, and less on the end product. Finally, accept and support leadership from Indigenous groups. So we've covered a lot in the last 25 minutes. I started out by explaining some basic information about UNDRIP and how UNDRIP connects to planning. I've offered you 3 insights on how to think about UNDRIP articles, that they are collective rights, that nations define key aspects of any project, and that UNDRIP requires collaboration and cooperation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous governments, and this will be led by nations. I took you briefly through the case study of the Indigenous Housing Fund and explored how such a housing program might be different if it incorporated UNDRIP. The result of my case study is that a housing program which incorporated UNDRIP would be focused around support, flexibility, and building up the unique qualities identified as important by a nation. Finally, I shared a few words about capacity building and emphasized the importance of building the capacity of planners to step back, listen deeply, and be good partners and followers. It's been a pleasure being with you here at this conference. Thank you for attending my presentation. I hope you have an excellent day.